fragmentary data recovered from long-abandoned manufactorum vaults, sealed void station cogitators, and half-erased administratum survey logs has revealed recurring references to heavily corrupted Knight pattern war engines operating beyond sanctioned Imperial command structures. These references do not appear in formal Knight House genealogies, nor within the standard Questoris household registries maintained on Mars or Terra. Instead, they emerge irregularly across disparate regions, often associated with planetary collapses, mass population disappearances, or prolonged warp instability following compliance failures. Recovered pict feeds show towering bipedal engines bearing the core structural profiles of Questoris and Cerastus Knight chassis, yet heavily altered. Armor plating appears unevenly reinforced, marked by organic growths, ritual scarring, and extensive iconographic defacement. Auspex data attached to these feeds is frequently incomplete, corrupted by warp interference, or deliberately redacted. Eyewitness accounts, where available, describe these engines acting independently, without visible support formations, responding to no identifiable command authority, and engaging Imperial or Xenos forces with indiscriminate hostility. The consistency of these sightings across multiple millennia suggests not isolated heretics or renegade pilots, but the existence of a distinct and persistent classification of corrupted Knight war engines. Cross-referencing Mechanicus anomaly registries, Inquisition threat indexes, and Forbidden Knight House Apocrypha eventually led to a single recurring designation, appearing in sealed marginalia and censored annotations. The term, always isolated and never elaborated upon, is recorded as the Questor Traitoris. The earliest confirmed origins of the Questor Traitoris are inseparable from the history of Imperial Knight houses themselves. During the early expansion of the Great Crusade, Knight worlds were reintegrated into the Imperium as semi-autonomous feudal domains. These planets had survived Old Knight through the presence of ancient Knight suits, originally standard template construct derivatives intended for planetary defense, resource control, and megafauna suppression. Over time, these machines became symbols of rulership, with noble bloodlines bound to specific thrones mechanicum through hereditary neural compatibility. Knight houses swore oaths of fealty to the Imperium, most often through the Adeptus Mechanicus rather than directly to Terra. In exchange for protection, technological maintenance, and political legitimacy, the houses provided their knights for Imperial military campaigns. This arrangement granted them significant autonomy, allowing cultural traditions, feudal hierarchies, and local belief systems to persist largely unaltered. While this independence was considered acceptable during the Great Crusade, it would later prove to be a critical vulnerability. During the Horus Heresy, this vulnerability was fully exposed. When Warmaster Horus initiated his rebellion, the fracture lines within the Imperium spread rapidly, and Knight worlds were no exception. Isolated by distance and reliant on incomplete or manipulated astropathic communication, many Knight houses were forced to make allegiance decisions based on limited information. Some houses were directly coerced by traitor legions or dark mechanicum envoys. Others acted out of perceived survival necessity, swearing loyalty to Horus under the belief that Terra had already fallen. A significant number of Knight houses declared for the traitor cause. These houses brought with them entire lances of knights, fully functional and crewed by experienced nobles bonded to their thrones mechanicum. Unlike Space Marines, whose genetic and doctrinal conditioning created a unified ideological framework, Knight pilots retained deeply personal and dynastic motivations. Loyalty was owed first to house, lineage, and oath traditions, not to abstract Imperial ideals. This made ideological corruption both easier to initiate and harder to reverse. As the heresy progressed, these traitor Knight houses were increasingly exposed to the warp. Prolonged campaigns alongside the traitor legions placed them in direct proximity to demonic entities, corrupted forge worlds, and warp-saturated battlefields. The Thrones Mechanicum, already semi-sentient and psychologically invasive, began to record and echo these influences. Over time, the mental imprints of previous pilots, battle trauma, and warp exposure accumulated within the machine spirits of the Knights. By the final stages of the heresy, many traitor knights exhibited behavioral deviations. Reports describe autonomous target selection, increased aggression beyond pilot input, and auditory hallucinations experienced by pilots during combat. In some recorded cases, pilots were found deceased within their thrones, yet the knight engines continued to operate for extended periods, guided by residual neural echoes and corrupted machine spirits. Following the defeat of Horus and the retreat of the traitor legions into the Eye of Terror, the surviving traitor knight houses fractured. Some fled into warp-controlled regions alongside their allied legions. Others attempted to remain hidden within Imperial space, masking their corruption and falsifying allegiance records. A number of houses collapsed entirely, their worlds destroyed during subsequent Imperial retribution campaigns. However, destruction was rarely total. Knights are resilient war engines, and many survived even when their homeworlds did not. It is from this period that the Questor Traitoris designation begins to solidify. Unlike formally recognized Chaos Knight houses that later emerged within the Eye of Terror, the Questor Traitoris refers to knight engines and pilots who had fully severed their feudal and political structures. These were not houses in the traditional sense. They were remnants, exiles, and war survivors, bound only to their machines and whatever ideological or demonic influence had claimed them. Over the following millennia, these corrupted knights persisted in small numbers. Some aligned themselves with the Dark Mechanicum, offering their engines as testbeds for forbidden augmentation in exchange for maintenance and warp-infused upgrades. Others became mercenary assets for Chaos warbands, deployed as shock units during Black Crusades or planetary assaults. A significant portion, however, appear to have operated entirely independently. The independence of the Questor Traitoris is one of their defining early traits. Without house command structures, and often without living support crews, these knights became singular entities. The bond between pilot and throne mechanicum deepened unnaturally, with pilots experiencing accelerated psychological degradation. In several documented instances, pilots willingly allowed demonic entities to merge with their thrones in order to stabilize or enhance combat performance. This process erased any remaining distinction between machine, pilot, and warp presence. Physiological records recovered from captured thrones. Mechanicum fragments indicate extreme neural scarring. Synaptic pathways show evidence of recursive feedback loops, where machine spirit impulses override pilot motor functions entirely. In some cases, human neural tissue appears partially replaced or sustained by warp-based energy, allowing the pilot to survive far beyond natural biological limits. Whether such pilots can still be classified as human remains a matter of sealed Inquisition debate. By the mid-millennia 31st, the Questor Traitoris were no longer merely traitor knights. They had become a distinct existential category. Imperial records from this era ceased to describe them as corrupted war machines, and instead classify them as roaming macro-scale warp entities bound within knight chassis. This shift in language reflects a growing recognition that conventional anti-armor doctrines were insufficient when confronting these engines. The long isolation of many Questor Traitoris knights further accelerated their divergence. Without access to standard Mechanicus maintenance, their machines underwent improvised repairs, scavenged part integration, and ritualistic reinforcement. Armor plates were reforged using incompatible alloys. Internal systems were exposed and rebuilt without regard for original standard template construct design principles. Over time, no two Questor Traitoris knights remained identical, even when derived from the same original pattern. Despite this degradation, or perhaps because of it, many Questor Traitoris demonstrated combat capabilities exceeding those of loyalist counterparts. Warp-assisted locomotion allowed brief bursts of speed beyond mechanical limits. Weapon systems displayed anomalous energy readings, with thermal output and kinetic impact exceeding design tolerances. These enhancements came at a cost. Knights exhibiting such traits often destabilized local reality, triggering warp manifestations, atmospheric distortion, and psychological collapse among nearby unprotected personnel. It is important to note that not all Questor Traitoris originated from the Horus heresy. While the majority trace their lineage to that conflict, later instances occurred during subsequent millennia. Night worlds cut off by warp storms, subjected to prolonged chaos influence, or infiltrated by dark mechanicum agents occasionally produced new traitor knights. These later conversions followed similar patterns, suggesting that the throne mechanicum itself is inherently vulnerable to corruption under specific conditions. By the opening centuries of Millennia 41, the Questor Traitoris had become a known but poorly understood threat category. Their appearances were rare but catastrophic. Administratum casualty projections associated with confirmed sightings consistently exceed initial estimates by significant margins. Entire regiments have been lost attempting to neutralize single corrupted knights, particularly when engagements occurred in confined environments such as hive cities or industrial zones. The continued existence of the Questor Traitoris represents a fundamental failure of Imperial control over its oldest war machines. They are relics of a bygone era, carrying within them the unresolved consequences of the Imperium's reliance on feudal autonomy and ancient technology. Their origins are not the result of sudden betrayal, but of systemic neglect, ideological rigidity, and the dangerous assumption that tradition equates to loyalty. In this way, the Questor Traitoris stand as enduring evidence that corruption within the Imperium does not always announce itself through open rebellion. Sometimes it is preserved, maintained, and even venerated until it walks once more across the battlefield, bearing the weight of millennia of accumulated failure. By the time the Questor Traitoris classification became broadly recognized within sealed Imperial threat registries, their divergence from loyalist knight patterns was no longer limited to allegiance or doctrine. The physical, mechanical, and behavioral traits of these engines had altered to such a degree that visual identification alone was often sufficient to distinguish them from sanctioned Questoris or Cerastus knights. These distinctions were not uniform, nor did they follow standardized corruption patterns. Instead, they reflected prolonged exposure to warp influence, ad hoc modification, and the cumulative degradation of Throne's mechanicum operating far beyond intended tolerances. Structurally, the core skeletal frames of Questor Traitoris knights remain recognizable as Imperial Knight derivatives. Leg articulation geometry, torso mass distribution, and reactor placement are broadly consistent with known standard template construct baselines. However, extensive reinforcement is frequently observed. Armor plating is rarely symmetrical. Replacement plates are often thicker than standard issue, bolted or fused directly onto damaged sections without regard for balance optimization. In several documented cases, entire limb assemblies have been replaced with incompatible patterns scavenged from other knight wrecks or heavy industrial machinery. This irregular construction contributes to a distinctive silhouette. Questor Traitoris knights often appear hunched or forward-leaning, their mass unevenly distributed. Locomotion data shows altered gait patterns, including shortened stride cycles, exaggerated knee articulation, or asymmetric weight transfer. These traits are not indicative of mechanical failure. On the contrary, they appear to be adaptive responses, allowing the engine to compensate for overburdened armor and internal growths without sacrificing battlefield mobility. One of the most consistent physical traits is the presence of organic intrusion within mechanical systems. All-spec scans and post-engagement battlefield recovery reports describe fibrous tissue integrated into actuator housings, cabling channels, and even reactor shielding. This tissue is not merely superficial. In some cases, it replaces damaged components entirely, functioning as both structural reinforcement and signal conduit. Mechanicus analysis suggests these growths are sustained by warp energy rather than conventional biological processes, rendering standard purification or sterilization procedures ineffective. The exterior surfaces of Questor Traitoris knights are typically marked by extensive ritual modification. Armor plates bear etched sigils, layered scars, and iconography associated with chaos powers, renegade knight houses, or personal heraldry warped beyond recognition. Paint schemes, where present, are irregular and often applied over multiple historical layers. Loyalist heraldry is sometimes visible beneath more recent markings, suggesting gradual ideological decay rather than immediate repudiation. Iconoclastic elements such as chained trophies, impaled remains, or fused battlefield debris are frequently observed. These are not decorative in the traditional sense. In many cases, they serve ritual or symbolic functions tied to the knight's continued operation. Some Dark Mechanicum sources suggest that certain external additions act as warp anchors or focus points, stabilizing internal demonic presences bound within the Throne Mechanicum or reactor core. Internally, the most significant divergence lies within the Throne Mechanicum interface. In Loyalist Knights, the throne serves as a control nexus, translating pilot neural impulses into mechanical action while enforcing psychological stability through layered machine spirit safeguards. In Questor Traitoris Knights, these safeguards are either degraded or deliberately removed. Neural interface density is increased through the addition of unauthorized synaptic amplifiers, warp reactive circuitry, or direct demonic integration. This results in a radically altered pilot experience, where Loyalist pilots must exert continuous mental discipline to command their knights. Questor Traitoris pilots often describe the machine as an extension of their own cognition. Recorded interrogations and recovered data logs indicate that the distinction between pilot intent and machine response becomes increasingly blurred over time. Reaction speeds increase, but at the cost of cognitive autonomy. The knight begins to anticipate and in some cases override pilot decision. In extreme cases, the Throne Mechanicum no longer requires a living pilot in the conventional sense. Some Questor Traitoris Knights operate with pilots sustained in a state of partial neural dissolution, their consciousness distributed throughout the machine systems. Others appear to be guided entirely by composite machine spirits, formed from the accumulated neural echoes of previous pilots. These entities exhibit consistent behavioral patterns, suggesting continuity of identity despite the absence of a biological operator. The reactor systems of Questor Traitoris Knights also show significant divergence. While many retain modified plasma reactors derived from Imperial designs, these are frequently supplemented by warp reactive components. Observed anomalies include reactors that operate without measurable fuel input, emit non-thermal energy signatures, or fluctuate output in response to emotional or environmental stimuli. Such behavior is incompatible with known Imperial engineering principles and strongly indicative of warp-based power augmentation. This reactor instability directly influences weapon performance. Questor Traitoris armaments often exceed known output limits, delivering destructive force disproportionate to their apparent scale. Thermal weapons burn hotter and longer. Kinetic weapons strike with abnormal penetrative capability. Energy discharge patterns frequently show non-Euclidean dispersion, allowing weapons to affect targets partially shielded or obscured by terrain. Primary armaments vary widely, reflecting both the original Knight pattern and subsequent modification history. Standard Questoris battle cannons, thermal lances, and rapid-fire battle cannons remain common foundations. However, these weapons are almost always altered. Barrels are elongated or reinforced. Cooling systems are overbuilt or replaced entirely. Ammunition feed mechanisms are modified to accept corrupted or warp-infused munitions supplied by Dark Mechanicum forges or generated internally by the Knight itself. Thermal weapons used by Questor Traitoris Knights are of particular concern. These systems often exhibit temperature readings far beyond theoretical containment limits. In several engagements, thermal lances have been observed melting through void shields, designed to withstand sustained orbital bombardment. Post-battle analysis suggests that these weapons partially bypass physical defenses by inducing localized reality destabilization at the point of impact, rather than relying solely on thermal energy transfer. Close combat weaponry is equally divergent. Reaper chainswords and thunderstrike gauntlets are commonly retained but heavily modified. Teeth and impact surfaces are reforged using unknown alloys, sometimes incorporating demonic entities bound into the weapon itself. These modifications produce weapons that generate psychic backlash upon impact, disrupting enemy morale and causing neurological trauma among nearby infantry even when no direct contact occurs. Several Questor Traitoris Knights favour exclusively melee-focused loadouts. These engines are optimised for shock assaults, utilising reinforced leg actuators and warp-assisted movement to close distance rapidly. Observers note that such knights exhibit predatory movement patterns, altering trajectory mid-charge in ways that defy conventional inertia. Whether this is achieved through localised gravity manipulation or limited temporal distortion remains unconfirmed. Defensive systems show similar deviation. Ion shields, where present, are unstable but exceptionally powerful. Rather than forming a consistent protective field, corrupted ion shields fluctuate in intensity and geometry. This unpredictability makes targeting difficult, as shield coverage shifts in response to incoming fire rather than following fixed projection arcs. In some instances, shields have been observed absorbing energy and then discharging it outward in uncontrolled bursts. Armour resilience is further enhanced by regenerative properties. Damage that would permanently disable Loyalist Knights is sometimes observed to partially reverse over time. Breached armour seals reknit, exposed cabling retracts, or is replaced by organic growth. While this regeneration is slow, it significantly extends battlefield endurance, allowing Questor Traitoris Knights to disengage, recover, and return to combat without external repair. Sensor and targeting systems also diverge significantly from Imperial norms. Questor Traitoris Knights often operate without reliance on conventional Auspex arrays. Visual sensors are supplemented or replaced by warp-derived perception, allowing detection of targets obscured by smoke, electronic countermeasures, or even solid matter. This capability is not precise in the traditional sense, but provides an intuitive awareness of hostile presence within a defined radius. This perception comes at a cost. Such knights are highly sensitive to psychic activity. They're drawn toward concentrations of emotional intensity, conflict, or fear, sometimes altering operational priorities mid-engagement to pursue targets of perceived symbolic or psychic significance rather than strategic value. This behaviour contributes to the unpredictability of Questor Traitoris battlefield action. Despite their corruption, Questor Traitoris Knights retain a degree of internal coherence. Systems do not degrade randomly. Instead, modifications follow emergent patterns driven by survival, combat effectiveness, and the reinforcement of the pilot machine entity. Over time, each knight becomes a self-optimizing war engine, shaped by accumulated engagements and internalized ideology. It is important to note that no two Questor Traitoris Knights are identical. While broad categories of modification exist, each engine represents a unique convergence of original design, corruption vector, pilot psychology, and external influence. This individuality complicates Imperial countermeasures. Tactics effective against one corrupted knight often fail against another, even within the same engagement theatre. From a classification standpoint, the distinctive traits and gear of the Questor Traitoris place them outside conventional mechanized threat categories. They are not simply corrupted vehicles, nor are they fully demonic entities. They exist in an unstable intermediary state, combining ancient human engineering, warped machine intelligence, and immaterial influence into a single combat platform. By Millennia 41, Year 300, Imperial doctrinal revisions increasingly emphasize avoidance and containment, rather than direct engagement when Questor Traitoris Knights are encountered. This shift reflects a growing recognition that their distinctive traits and weapon systems represent not only a physical threat, but a systemic failure of predictability within Imperial war planning. The Questor Traitoris does not merely fight the Imperium using corrupted tools. It embodies the transformation of Imperial technology itself into a hostile force, reshaped through neglect, autonomy, and prolonged exposure to powers never meant to interface with human design. The psychological profile of the Questor Traitoris cannot be examined through conventional human metrics alone. While each instance originates from an individual knight pilot, the prolonged fusion between pilot consciousness, throne mechanicum, and warp influence produces a composite entity whose behaviour reflects multiple layers of agency. what emerges over time is not simply a corrupted noble, but a fused will in which memory, instinct, machine logic, and immaterial influence coexist in unstable equilibrium. Early in the corruption process, personality traits often reflect those already present within the pilot prior to defection or exposure. Pride, territoriality, obsession with lineage, and an entrenched sense of entitlement are common among knight nobility even within loyalist houses. In Questor Traitoris cases, these traits are amplified rather than replaced. The throne mechanicum reinforces dominant emotional patterns through recursive neural imprinting, causing specific impulses to repeat and intensify after each engagement. As autonomy erodes, decision-making becomes less reflective and more instinctive. Questor Traitoris entities exhibit strong behavioral consistency across engagements, suggesting the emergence of fixed cognitive loops. Some prioritize the destruction of specific symbols, such as imperial banners, command vehicles, or religious structures. Others demonstrate fixation on armored adversaries, engaging titans or super-heavy vehicles even when tactically disadvantageous. These patterns are not random. They reflect internalized identity conflicts preserved within the fused consciousness. Over extended operational timelines, individuality becomes paradoxically sharper rather than diluted. Unlike Chaos Space Marines, whose personalities are often subsumed by legion culture or patron deity alignment, Questor Traitoris entities remain intensely self-referential. They perceive themselves not as servants, but as sovereign actors. This self-concept is reinforced by their physical scale, battlefield dominance, and isolation from peer command structures. Communication records indicate that many Questor Traitoris do not respond to external authority, including chaos-aligned commanders. When interaction does occur, it is typically framed as negotiation rather than obedience. They will align temporarily with larger war efforts when objectives coincide, but disengage without warning once personal criteria are satisfied. Attempts to impose command hierarchy upon them frequently result in immediate hostility. This behavioral independence is central to their organizational alignment. The Questor Traitoris does not represent a unified faction. There is no standing command structure, no shared doctrine, and no consistent allegiance to a specific chaos power. While some exhibit iconographic or behavioral traits associated with particular warp entities, these alignments are best understood as functional rather than devotional. Patronage is accepted when it enhances survivability or combat effectiveness, not as an act of faith. Several documented cases show Questor Traitoris operating alongside the Dark Mechanicum. These relationships are transactional. The Knight provides battlefield data, test conditions, or direct protection in exchange for maintenance, augmentation, or arcane repair. Even in these arrangements, control remains contested. Dark Mechanicum logs frequently note containment failures, asset loss, or unplanned deviation during joint operations involving corrupted knights. Others operate entirely outside organized chaos forces. These solitary Questor Traitoris function as roaming engines of conflict, drawn toward war zones by psychic resonance rather than strategic planning. They may appear without warning, engage for extended periods, and then withdraw into uncharted regions of space or warp-distorted territories. Such entities are often referred to in Imperial records as persistent anomalies rather than active threats, due to the difficulty of prediction or pursuit. Despite their independence, Questor Traitoris entities are not socially inert. Some maintain residual loyalty to corrupted remnants of their original knight houses. In rare cases, small groupings of corrupted knights operate together, bound by shared origin rather than coordinated command. These formations lack formal hierarchy. Leadership is determined situationally, often through dominance displays or battlefield performance rather than declared rank. Conflict between Questor Traitoris entities has also been recorded. These encounters are not ideological disputes, but territorial or identity-driven clashes. When two such entities converge within the same operational space, engagement is likely unless their internal priorities align. These conflicts are often disproportionately destructive, as neither party demonstrates risk aversion or retreat logic typical of organised forces. From an Imperial analytical perspective, the Questor Traitoris represents a convergence failure across multiple systems. Psychologically, they embody the breakdown of pilot-machine boundaries. Organisationally, they expose the long-term risks of feudal military autonomy. Technologically, they demonstrate the vulnerability of ancient systems designed without safeguards against warp integration. Their continued existence challenges several foundational assumptions of Imperial doctrine. First, that loyalty can be inherited and preserved through tradition alone. Second, that machine spirits remain stable when isolated from centralized oversight. Third, that corruption is a reversible or containable state when applied to macro-scale war assets. The Questor Traitoris disproves each assumption through persistent adaptive survival. Attempts at re-sanctification or recovery have uniformly failed. In cases where Questor Traitoris Knights were disabled rather than destroyed, recovery teams reported immediate psychological collapse, spontaneous warp manifestation, or catastrophic system rejection upon attempted separation of pilot and machine. These outcomes suggest that by a certain point, the composite entity becomes irreducible. Destruction is the only viable termination method. Even so, confirmed kills remain rare. The resource expenditure required to neutralize a single Questor Traitoris often exceeds that of multiple conventional engagements. This cost-benefit imbalance has influenced Imperial strategic posture, particularly in fringe regions. Increasingly, containment, redirection, or strategic withdrawal is favored over direct confrontation unless critical assets are threatened. From a long-term analytical standpoint, the Questor Traitoris should not be viewed solely as a chaos-aligned threat. They are a byproduct of Imperial structural design choices made during early expansion. The reliance on hereditary command, semi-autonomous war machines, and localized maintenance authority created conditions in which corruption could incubate undetected for millennia. Their personalities, while warped, remain intelligible. Pride, resentment, fixation, and a desire for recognition recur across cases. These traits mirror those found in Loyalist Knight nobility, suggesting that the difference between sanctioned and traitor outcomes lies not in individual disposition, but in environmental exposure and institutional response. Where oversight failed, corruption persisted. Where isolation endured, identity ossified. In this sense, the Questor Traitoris functions as a living archive of accumulated error. Each entity carries within it layers of historical failure, preserved and weaponized through time. Their independence is not freedom, but the terminal result of severed accountability. Their power is not innovation, but distortion. By millennia 41, year 300, the Questor Traitoris occupies a unique position within Imperial threat classification. Neither army nor anomaly alone, it represents a persistent, self-sustaining hazard whose presence destabilizes both physical and psychological battlefields. Their unpredictability undermines strategic forecasting. Their individuality resists standardization of response. The final analytical consensus, where one exists, is notably restrained. The Questor Traitoris is not expanding exponentially, nor does it require eradication at any cost. Instead, it endures. It persists across centuries as a reminder that war engines built to outlast generations may also outlast the systems meant to control them. In this persistence lies their true danger, not in numbers, but in continuity. The Questor Traitoris survives not because it is supported, but because it no longer depends on anything beyond itself. Machine, pilot, and corruption have fused into a closed system, capable of sustaining conflict indefinitely. Within the record-keeping bodies of the Imperium, the Questor Traitoris occupies an unusual and persistently unstable classification space. Unlike most chaos-aligned threats, which can be indexed according to factional affiliation, campaign history, or territorial control, corrupted knights resist consistent categorization. As a result, their documentation is fragmented across multiple Imperial institutions, each interpreting the phenomenon through its own operational priorities and analytical framework. The Adeptus Administratum first encounters evidence of Questor Traitoris activity not as a military anomaly, but as a logistical inconsistency. Initial indicators typically emerge in the form of disrupted tithes, unexplained population loss, or sudden cessation of planetary output. These signals rarely identify the cause directly. Instead, administratum auditors note cascading failures across infrastructure sectors that had previously remained stable for centuries. Patterns recur across multiple cases. Agri-worlds experience synchronized crop failure despite favorable climatic data. Forge-adjacent mining worlds report catastrophic labor depletion within compressed timeframes. Frontier systems lose entire PDF regiments without formal casualty declarations. When cross-referenced retroactively, these disruptions often align temporally with unconfirmed night-scale engagements recorded in peripheral military logs or astropathic distress fragment. Administratum analysts approach these findings conservatively. Due to the scale of the Imperium, localized collapse does not automatically imply hostile action. Warp storms, Xenos raids, and bureaucratic error account for the majority of such discrepancies. However, when correlated across sectors, a distinct pattern emerges. The presence of a Questor Traitoris tends to generate asymmetric damage profiles that do not conform to known invasion or rebellion models. One of the most consistent logistical indicators is disproportionate infrastructure loss relative to engagement duration. Worlds affected by Questor Traitoris activity often suffer long-term economic collapse following remarkably brief conflict windows. In several cases, recorded hostilities last no more than a few standard days, yet planetary recovery timelines extend into multiple centuries. This discrepancy prompts deeper investigation by administratum data scholars. Supply chain analysis reveals the underlying mechanism. The Questor Traitoris does not target population centers exclusively, nor does it engage in systematic conquest. Instead, it disrupts key nodes. Void ports, power distribution hubs, manufacturum control spires, and water reclamation facilities are repeatedly identified as primary impact zones. The destruction of these nodes triggers cascading failure across planetary systems, rendering recovery prohibitively expensive under standard Imperial resource allocation models. From an administratum perspective, this form of damage is uniquely inefficient to repair. Unlike conventional warfare, where victory allows for reclamation of intact infrastructure, Questor Traitoris engagements often leave no usable assets. The corrupted Knight's weapon output and destabilizing presence render affected zones uninhabitable or mechanically unsalvageable. In accounting terms, such worlds shift rapidly from productive assets to long-term liabilities. As a result, administratum policy responses increasingly emphasize containment rather than reclamation. Worlds exposed to confirmed or suspected Questor Traitoris activity are frequently reclassified. Tithe grades are reduced or suspended. Population growth projections are revised downward. In extreme cases, planets are quietly downgraded to marginal status, with minimal further investment allocated. These decisions are rarely attributed to the Knight's presence in official summaries, instead citing generalized instability or unsustainable recovery costs. Parallel to this administrative response, the Adeptus Mechanicus conducts its own analysis, driven by fundamentally different priorities. For the Mechanicus, the Questor Traitoris represents both a technological aberration and a data loss catastrophe. Each corrupted Knight chassis embodies a deviation from sacred standard template construct principles, yet also preserves fragments of ancient design knowledge inaccessible through orthodox channels. Mechanicus impressions are divided along ideological lines. Conservative factions within the cult Mechanicus classify the Questor Traitoris as irredeemable techno-heresy. From this perspective, the corrupted Knight is not a machine in error, but a profaned relic whose continued existence constitutes an affront to the Omnissiah. Such factions advocate for immediate destruction and data denial, prioritizing containment over study. Other Mechanicus elements adopt a more analytical stance. They argue that the persistence and adaptability of Questor Traitoris Knights indicate emergent system behaviors worthy of examination. These entities operate beyond intended design parameters, yet maintained structural coherence over millennia. To some magi, this suggests undiscovered principles of machine resilience, autonomous repair logic, or warp reactive engineering that could, if isolated, enhance Imperial technology. This ideological divide influences how data is collected and interpreted. In sanctioned engagements, Mechanicus observers prioritize telemetry extraction. Auspex drones, servo skulls, and deep spectrum sensors are deployed to capture reactor fluctuations, energy discharge patterns, and neural interface activity. Much of this data is incomplete, distorted by warp interference, or lost when observation platforms are destroyed. Nevertheless, enough fragments have been recovered to support several broad analytical conclusions. One such conclusion concerns operational independence. Mechanicus analysts note that Questor Traitoris Knights exhibit no reliance on external supply lines. Ammunition expenditure does not correlate with visible resupply operations. Energy output remains stable or increases despite apparent reactor damage. Maintenance cycles, as understood in Imperial doctrine, are absent. This self-sufficiency challenges core assumptions about large-scale war engine sustainability. Logistical modelling attempts to account for this anomaly through several hypotheses. Some posit that corrupted knights convert ambient warp energy directly into usable power. Others suggest that internalized demonic entities perform continuous system stabilization and repair. A more conservative hypothesis proposes that Questor Traitoris simply operate on borrowed time, expending finite reserves that have not yet reached depletion. Longitudinal data, however, undermines this view. Several knights tracked across centuries show no measurable performance decline. Another key analytical focus is deployment behavior. Administratum and Mechanicus data converge on the conclusion that Questor Traitoris appearances are not random. While they lack strategic coordination, their emergence correlates strongly with regions experiencing high conflict density, political instability, or prolonged emotional distress among populations. This correlation persists even when controlling for warp storm frequency. From a logistical standpoint, this behavior complicates threat forecasting. Traditional predictive models rely on enemy objectives, territorial expansion, or resource acquisition. The Questor Traitoris conforms to none of these. It does not hold ground, extract materials, or establish bases. Its presence is transient yet devastating, leaving behind economic voids rather than occupied zones. Mechanicus analytics frame this as resonance-based movement rather than navigation. The knight is drawn, not directed. Its internal systems appear to respond to psychic or emotional gradients within real space, steering it toward conflict-rich environments. This interpretation aligns with recorded deviations in course mid-translation, where knights abandon projected targets in favor of unexpected destinations. Administratum planners struggle to integrate such behavior into sector defense protocols. Static fortifications and layered response strategies assume predictable threat vectors. A Questor Traitoris can bypass these assumptions entirely, emerging where defenses are weakest not through planning, but through attraction. This unpredictability increases the administrative cost of preparedness, forcing sectors to maintain elevated readiness without clear justification. Resource allocation reports reflect this strain. Worlds within known Questor Traitoris migration corridors receive increased garrison quotas and infrastructure hardening funds, despite low conventional threat ratings. Over time, these preventative expenditures erode sector-wide efficiency metrics, leading to internal review and budgetary conflict within the administratum. In some cases, threat warnings are downplayed or ignored to preserve short-term fiscal stability. Mechanicus logistical findings add another layer of complexity. Attempts to deploy specialized anti-knight assets reveal diminishing returns. Weapons calibrated to penetrate standard knight armor frequently underperform against corrupted variants. Machine logic subroutines designed to counter Imperial ion shield behavior fail against unstable, adaptive shield geometries. Each engagement generates new data, but that data rapidly becomes obsolete. This adaptive resistance frustrates Mechanicus optimization doctrine. Normally, repeated encounters allow refinement of countermeasures. With the Questor Traitoris, each instance behaves as a unique system. Statistical modelling becomes unreliable. Predictive maintenance of defensive assets is undermined by the Knight's capacity to exceed known performance envelopes without warning. As a result, internal Mechanicus memoranda increasingly classify Questor Traitoris encounters as non-repeatable events. Each engagement is treated as a singular anomaly rather than a representative sample. While this approach improves localized analysis, it prevents the development of standardized counter-doctrine. Knowledge accumulates, but application remains situational. From the combined Administratum and Mechanicus perspective, the Questor Traitoris represents a logistical paradox. It is too rare to justify sector-wide rearmament, yet too destructive to ignore. It does not threaten imperial territory through conquest, yet it undermines imperial sustainability through targeted disruption. It cannot be reliably tracked, yet its long-term economic impact exceeds that of many formal invasions. This paradox influences official language. In many high-level documents, the Questor Traitoris is not described as an enemy, but as a destabilizing factor. Its presence is treated similarly to prolonged warp turbulence or systemic decay, something to be managed, mitigated, and endured rather than decisively eliminated. Such framing reveals an implicit administrative admission. The Imperium lacks the capacity to resolve the Questor Traitoris problem conclusively. It can respond, adapt, and absorb losses, but not impose finality. For institutions built on permanence, hierarchy, and control, this admission is deeply destabilizing. Thus, within Administratum ledgers and Mechanicus data vaults, the Questor Traitoris exists less as a singular horror and more as an accounting inevitability. A recurring line item of loss, deviation, and inefficiency. Its continued operation is not evidence of chaos superiority, but of imperial systemic limits when confronted with autonomous, self-sustaining war constructs beyond doctrinal reach. Documented conflicts involving the Questor Traitoris are characterized less by formal campaign records and more by fragmented engagement reports dispersed across multiple imperial archives. Unlike large-scale invasions or crusades, these encounters rarely carry official campaign designations. Instead, they are reconstructed retrospectively through casualty logs, Mechanicus telemetry fragments, astropathic distress echoes, and post-conflict planetary audits. One of the earliest post-heresy engagements widely accepted as involving a Questor Traitoris occurred during the later years of Millennia 31, following the Scouring. Administratum recovery teams dispatched to a previously compliant Knight-adjacent agri-world in the Segmentum Obscurus reported the near-total annihilation of planetary defense forces within a single rotation cycle. Initial assumptions attributed the destruction to Traitor Legion remnants. However, battlefield analysis identified damage patterns inconsistent with Legion armor or Titan-grade weaponry. Surviving Auspex fragments recovered from orbital debris recorded the presence of a single, Knight-scale energy signature, moving independently across multiple theatres of engagement. The entity did not deploy alongside infantry or armor formations. Instead, it engaged PDF concentration sequentially, disabling void shield generators, reactor hubs, and command nexuses before withdrawing into wasteland regions. No attempt was made to hold territory. Administratum auditors later reclassified the incident as a Questor Traitoris engagement based on these patterns. During Millennia 33, a cluster of frontier worlds along a minor warp corridor experienced a series of rapid collapses over a period of less than 2 standard years. Each world fell independently, with no recorded fleet action or sustained invasion. Mechanicus exploratory fleets dispatched afterward found Manufactorum ruins bearing evidence of extreme thermal and kinetic stress, localized around central control structures. In several locations, Knight-sized footprints were discovered fused into bedrock strata, indicating repeated stationary combat maneuvers. Mechanicus logic engines attempting to reconstruct engagement timelines concluded that a single corrupted Knight could have accounted for the observed damage, provided it possessed sustained operational capability beyond known Imperial limits. This conclusion was initially rejected as statistically improbable. Only after cross-referencing with sealed Inquisition threat indices was the Questor Traitoris designation formally applied to the incident cluster. A more extensively documented conflict occurred during Millennia 36, year 412, involving a fortified mining world supplying adamantium ore to multiple forge worlds. Administratum records indicate the sudden loss of all surface communications, followed by erratic distress signals describing a sovereign engine advancing through defensive lines without support. The language of these reports was deemed unreliable and heavily censored. Mechanicus observers attached to the planetary garrison managed to transmit partial telemetry before their destruction. These data fragments describe an engagement lasting approximately 9 standard hours. During this period, the Questor Traitoris entity destroyed 3 void shield arrays, 2 macro cannon emplacements, and the primary orbital elevator anchorage. Casualty estimates exceed 90% of deployed defenders. Notably, the corrupted Knight did not engage orbital assets. It neither attempted to breach void supremacy nor interfere with Imperial Navy vessels in high orbit. After disabling planetary extraction and processing infrastructure, it withdrew into a tectonically unstable region and disappeared from augur range. Subsequent orbital bombardment of the region failed to produce confirmation of destruction. Administratum assessment classified the world as strategically compromised. Ore production ceased indefinitely. The cost of reconstruction exceeded projected tithe output for the next 5 centuries. The planet was downgraded and largely abandoned, with minimal population retained for salvage operations. During the later centuries of Millennia 38, several Questor Traitoris engagements were recorded in proximity to major war zones, particularly during large chaos incursions. In these cases, corrupted Knights appeared to operate in parallel with chaos forces rather than as integrated assets. One notable instance occurred during a Black Crusade-related offensive, where a Questor Traitoris was observed engaging Imperial Titans on a secondary front, while Chaos Space Marine forces pursued unrelated objectives elsewhere. Mechanicus battle logs indicate that the Knight did not coordinate its actions with traitor command elements. It entered the combat zone independently, engaged the largest available adversaries, and ignored opportunities to support Chaos ground advances. Its presence nonetheless destabilized Imperial defensive formations, drawing disproportionate resources away from primary invasion vectors. This behavior complicates attribution. Administratum analysts note that while the Questor Traitoris indirectly aided Chaos offensives, its actions cannot be interpreted as strategic cooperation. Rather, it exploited the conflict environment for its own operational priorities. In several cases, Chaos forces reportedly altered their advance paths to avoid proximity to the corrupted Knight, suggesting mutual unpredictability rather than alliance. Another significant documented conflict occurred during Millennia 39, involving a hive world undergoing internal rebellion. Administratum records initially classify the incident as a civil insurrection exacerbated by warp phenomena. However, sealed Mechanicus reports reveal that a Questor Traitoris entity emerged within the underhive zones, having apparently translated directly into the planet's gravity well, without detectable fleet presence. The Knight engaged both loyalist and rebel forces indiscriminately. Its advance collapsed multiple hive spires, triggering cascading population loss estimated in the tens of billions. Despite this devastation, the Knight avoided the upper hive's administrative core and withdrew after approximately 2 standard days of engagement. Post-conflict analysis struggled to explain this selective behavior. Some administratum scholars speculate that the Knight was drawn to zones of concentrated violence and emotional intensity rather than political authority. This remains unconfirmed. What is documented is the economic impact. The hive world's tithe grade was permanently reduced. Population recovery projections extend beyond acceptable Imperial planning horizons. Mechanicus salvage teams recovered fragments of Knight armor fused with hive superstructure materials, providing rare physical evidence of Questor Traitoris presence. Attempts to extract usable data resulted in multiple fatal incidents among tech priests due to residual warp contamination. The recovered fragments were eventually sealed and transferred to restricted vaults. In Millennia 40, increased attention was paid to Questor Traitoris encounters due to improved data aggregation across Imperial institutions. Several engagements during this period demonstrate recurring patterns. The corrupted Knights favour high-density infrastructure targets, engage for limited durations, and withdraw once systemic disruption thresholds are reached. They do not pursue total annihilation, nor do they establish occupation zone. One particularly well-documented battle occurred on a Forge-adjacent industrial moon during Millennia 40, year 890. Mechanicus defense cohorts engaged a Questor Traitoris entity, attempting to breach a reactor complex. The engagement lasted longer than typical encounters, extending over 18 standard hours. This duration allowed for unprecedented data capture. Telemetry confirms that the Knight adapted its attack patterns in real time, altering weapon selection and movement in response to defensive countermeasures. When direct assault failed, it redirected effort toward destabilizing power distribution nodes, triggering controlled reactor shutdowns that crippled the facility without causing catastrophic meltdown. This suggests a degree of operational restraint inconsistent with purely destructive intent. The Knight disengaged after achieving system paralysis, withdrawing into low-orbit debris fields. Despite sustained fire from multiple macro platforms, no confirmed kill was recorded. Mechanicus assessment concluded that the entity demonstrated strategic intelligence sufficient to identify critical system vulnerabilities beyond surface-level targets. Across all documented conflicts, one absence is consistently noted. Questor Traitoris entities do not pursue population extermination as a primary objective. Civilian casualties are high, but incidental. Their focus remains infrastructural and symbolic rather than demographic. Administratum analysts interpret this as further evidence that these Knights operate according to internally defined criteria, unrelated to conventional warfare goals. The cumulative record of wars and battles involving the Questor Traitoris reveals an enemy that does not seek victory in traditional terms. It does not conquer, govern, or retreat in defeat. Each conflict ends not with resolution, but with abandonment. Worlds are left destabilized, economically hollowed, and administratively burdensome. From a strategic standpoint, these engagements resist integration into Imperial war historiography. There are no campaigns to commemorate, no decisive battles to analyze. Instead, there are losses to be absorbed and anomalies to be filed. Each documented conflict adds data, but little clarity. Thus, within Administratium and Mechanicus war archives, the Questor Traitoris occupies a liminal space, present in conflict records, yet absent from victory tallies. Responsible for devastation, yet rarely acknowledged in public doctrine. Its wars are not fought for territory or ideology, but for disruption, resonance, and persistence. The aftermath of Questor Traitoris engagements presents a form of damage that Imperial institutions find uniquely difficult to resolve. Unlike conventional warfare, where losses can be measured in territory, materiel, and manpower, the consequences of corrupted Knight activity manifest as long-term systemic degradation. Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus records consistently emphasize that the true cost of these encounters is not the immediate destruction, but the enduring administrative and logistical instability that follows. In the immediate post-engagement phase, Administratum response protocols focus on verification rather than recovery. Due to the rarity of Questor Traitoris encounters and the frequency of false positives caused by warp phenomena, confirmation requires extensive cross-institutional review. This process alone can consume decades. By the time a world is formally classified as affected by a Questor Traitoris, critical recovery windows have often already closed. Once confirmation is achieved, planetary status reviews are initiated. These reviews assess population viability, infrastructure survivability, and projected tithe recovery. In the majority of cases, outcomes are unfavorable. Worlds subjected to Questor Traitoris activity exhibit damage patterns that invalidate standard reconstruction models. Power grids are destroyed at foundational nodes rather than peripheral stations. Data archives are corrupted beyond recovery. Industrial machinery is warped or contaminated in ways that prevent safe reactivation. Administrative analysts note that even when physical structures remain standing, their functional integrity is compromised. Residual warp contamination disrupts labor efficiency, increases equipment failure rates, and elevates rates of psychological collapse among surviving populations. These effects persist long after the Knight's departure, often worsening rather than stabilizing over time. As a result, projected recovery curves flatten rather than rebound. This leads to a gradual administrative reclassification process. Tithe expectations are reduced, sometimes repeatedly over successive reviews. Defense allocations are scaled down to match declining strategic value. In extreme cases, worlds are quietly removed from active development rosters. They are not declared lost, but neither are they meaningfully supported. Over centuries, such worlds drift into semi-abandonment, sustained only by minimal oversight and local inertia. From the administratum perspective, this outcome represents a form of strategic attrition. The Imperium does not lose territory in the conventional sense, but it loses productive capacity. Each Questor Traitoris encounter reduces the Imperium's long-term economic resilience, forcing reallocation of resources from stable sectors to compensate for silent losses elsewhere. Over millennia, this contributes to systemic strain that cannot be traced to a single enemy or campaign. The Adeptus Mechanicus confronts a different, though related, aftermath. Post-engagement access to Questor Traitoris sites is considered both an opportunity and a hazard. On one hand, Corrupted Knight remains off a rare insight into machine behavior beyond sanctioned parameters. On the other, these sites are among the most dangerous techno-archaeological environments recorded. Mechanicus recovery teams document extreme instability within damaged Knight components. Power systems continue to emit anomalous energy long after shutdown. Data cores exhibit recursive corruption, where attempts to extract information trigger cascading system failures or hostile activation sequences. Several recorded incidents describe partial reassembly or autonomous movement of severed Knight subsystems during recovery operations. As a result, Mechanicus protocols emphasize containment over extraction. Components deemed too unstable are encased and sealed rather than dismantled. Entire zones are sometimes declared permanently restricted, not due to active threat, but due to the unpredictable behavior of residual systems. These restrictions persist indefinitely, effectively removing valuable industrial regions from productive use. From an analytical standpoint, the Mechanicus identifies this as a failure of reversibility. In orthodox Imperial engineering, damage can be repaired, systems restored, and functionality recovered. Questor Traitoris corruption violates this principle. Once a Knight has operated beyond certain thresholds of warp integration, its components lose compatibility with standardized maintenance logic. They cannot be reintegrated into the greater technological ecosystem without risking further contamination. This realization has significant doctrinal implications. It challenges the cult Mechanicus belief that all machines, if properly understood, can be reclaimed. Internal treatises increasingly acknowledge that some forms of technological evolution, once initiated, cannot be reversed or isolated. The Questor Traitoris thus becomes a cautionary example of unbounded system autonomy. Administratum and Mechanicus analyses converge on one critical conclusion regarding aftermath management. Destruction alone is insufficient. Even when a Questor Traitoris is believed destroyed, its passage leaves behind secondary effects that must be managed for centuries. Warp instability, population displacement, industrial contamination, and administrative degradation persist independently of the Knight's continued existence. This recognition alters strategic calculus. Neutralizing a Questor Traitoris does not restore a world to its prior state, it merely prevents further degradation. As such, administratum planners increasingly evaluate engagement decisions not solely on military feasibility, but on post-conflict sustainability. In some cases, the projected aftermath cost of engagement outweighs the damage caused by allowing the Knight to pass through unopposed. Such conclusions are rarely stated explicitly in official doctrine. Instead, they are embedded in resource allocation patterns and silent operational choices. Worlds deemed unlikely to recover are quietly deprioritized. Defense assets are repositioned to protect higher value systems, even if that leaves peripheral regions exposed. This triage reflects an implicit acceptance of loss as a structural necessity. The Adeptus Mechanicus mirrors this pragmatism in its own way. Research directives increasingly focus on prevention rather than reclamation. Efforts are made to reinforce Throne Mechanicum safeguards, improve machine spirit isolation protocols, and limit long-term autonomous operation of Knight-class engines. These measures are framed as doctrinal refinements, but their underlying motivation is clear. The existence of the Questor Traitoris represents a boundary condition the Mechanicus wishes never to approach again. Final analytical summaries produced jointly by Administratum and Mechanicus bodies avoid definitive language. There is no declared solution, no projected end state. Instead, the Questor Traitoris is treated as a persistent variable within Imperial systems. It is modelled, tracked and accounted for, but not resolved. From an administrative viewpoint, this reflects institutional maturity rather than failure. The Imperium has endured threats it cannot eliminate before. Its strength lies not in total control, but in survival through adaptation. The Questor Traitoris is incorporated into this framework as a long-term destabilizing force, one that reshapes policy through absence as much as presence. The final consensus is restrained and utilitarian. The Questor Traitoris does not represent an existential threat to the Imperium. It does not multiply uncontrollably, nor does it dismantle Imperial authority directly. Instead, it erodes margins. It increases inefficiency, drains resources, and complicates planning. Over millennia, these effects accumulate, contributing to stagnation rather than collapse. For the Adeptus Administratum, the Questor Traitoris is a reminder that not all losses are dramatic. Some are incremental, recorded only in ledgers and projections. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, it is evidence that technological autonomy, once granted, may exceed the capacity of its creators to restrain it. Together, their analysis frames the Questor Traitoris not as a singular horror, but as a systemic consequence. A war engine that no longer fits within the structures designed to support or oppose it. Its aftermath lingers not in ruins alone, but in altered assumptions, constrained choices, and the quiet acceptance that some instruments of war once unleashed cannot be fully reclaimed. The surviving Inquisition records that address the Questor Traitoris are fragmentary by design, shaped as much by deliberate suppression as by genuine data loss. What exists does not resemble a cohesive case file, but rather a constellation of marginal notes, sealed annotations and cross-referenced warnings embedded within unrelated investigations. The earliest inquisitorial impressions do not describe the Questor Traitoris as a unified enemy classification, but as an anomalous deviation within the established Knight paradigms, one that resists the usual doctrinal boundaries applied to traitor forces. From the outset, the Inquisition treats these engines not merely as corrupted war machines, but as unstable variables capable of distorting entire threat assessments. Initial Ordo Hereticus observations focus on the psychological divergence evident in recovered pilot testimonies and intercepted transmissions. Unlike traitor Astartes or renegade guard commanders, Questor Traitoris nobles display a form of ideological elasticity that complicates categorization. Inquisitorial analysts repeatedly note that many pilots do not articulate allegiance to the dark gods in explicit theological terms. Instead, loyalty is framed through personal sovereignty, ancestral grievance, or the rejection of imperial oversight. This absence of uniform heretical doctrine leads to early internal disputes within the Ordos regarding jurisdiction, with some arguing these entities represent a socio-political schism rather than a purely demonic one. The Ordo Malleus contributes parallel observations that challenge this interpretation. While not all Questor Traitoris Knights demonstrate overt demonic possession, warp resonance scans conducted after several engagements reveal persistent low-grade empiric signatures embedded within their machine spirits. These signatures are inconsistent, fluctuating in intensity and character, suggesting neither standardized ritual corruption nor accidental exposure. Inquisition savants speculate that the Knight Throne Mechanicum itself, already a volatile interface between human cognition and machine will, acts as an amplifier for emotional and ideological extremity. In this view, the warp does not create the treachery but stabilizes it once initiated. One recurring note across multiple ordos concerns the unusual autonomy exhibited by Questor Traitoris forces. Unlike Chaos Space Marine warbands, which often display clear command hierarchies tied to legion lineage or patronage, Traitor Knight households operate as semi-sovereign entities. Inquisitorial observers describe them as mobile feudal states, each with its own internal codes, vendettas, and territorial claims. This decentralization frustrates predictive modeling. Attempts to map their movements against known Chaos Crusades repeatedly fail, as many Questor Traitoris campaigns appear motivated by localized objectives rather than participation in broader strategic offensives. Several sealed case files address encounters in which Questor Traitoris Knights acted counter to expected Chaos behavior. In at least 3 documented instances, Traitor Knight lances engaged and destroyed demonic allies following disputes over battlefield control or perceived dishonor. These incidents are flagged by Inquisitors as deeply troubling, not because of the immediate losses inflicted upon Chaos forces, but because they demonstrate an internal logic not fully aligned with the warp's typical incentives. Analysts warn that such entities cannot be reliably manipulated through conventional lures of power, favor, or ritual ascension. Unexplainable findings emerge most clearly in post-conflict examinations of battlefield remains. Recovery teams report that some destroyed Questor Traitoris Knights exhibit machine spirits that persist in hostile activity even after catastrophic structural failure. Vox echoes, weapon systems activating without power sources, and cogitator loops repeating personal oaths long after pilot death are recorded phenomena. Adeptus Mechanicus explanations are deemed insufficient by the Inquisition, as the behaviors do not correspond to known scrapcode profiles or demon engine classification. One Ordo Malleus memorandum raises the possibility that certain Questor Traitoris machine spirits have achieved a form of self-referential identity, independent of both pilot and warp entity. This hypothesis remains highly controversial, bordering on tech heresy, and is heavily redacted in most surviving copies. Nonetheless, its presence across multiple independent investigations suggests that the idea was taken seriously by senior inquisitorial authorities, at least as a theoretical risk. The Inquisition also documents inconsistencies in temporal perception surrounding Questor Traitoris engagements. Astropathic reports frequently arrive out of sequence, with distress calls referencing battles that Imperial forces have not yet reached, or conversely, describing conflicts that leave no subsequent physical trace. While such phenomena are not unheard of in warp-adjacent warfare, the frequency with which they accompany Knight Traitoris activity is noted as anomalous. Some Inquisitors speculate that the immense psychic and machine spirit mass of a Knight suit may create localized distortions, particularly when operated by a pilot whose psyche has been reshaped by prolonged Throne Mechanicum exposure. Observations on pilot behavior further complicate the threat profile. Interrogations of captured household serfs reveal that many Questor Traitoris nobles maintain rigid internal codes of conduct. Punishments for perceived disloyalty within their own ranks are often swift and severe, yet applied according to rules that mirror and sometimes exceed pre-heresy chivalric traditions. The Inquisition notes that this internal order contributes to their longevity as fighting forces. Unlike many Chaos formations that collapse under internal rivalry, Traitor Knight households can persist for centuries with minimal structural degradation. Several Inquisitors record unease at the apparent clarity of purpose exhibited by these pilots. Where other traitor entities display signs of psychic erosion, madness, or identity fragmentation, many Questor Traitoris nobles present as lucid, deliberate, and strategically patient. This challenges long-held assumptions regarding the inevitable degenerative effects of heresy and warp exposure, Marginal annotations question whether the Throne Mechanicum's constant feedback loop stabilizes the pilot's identity, even as it locks them permanently into a hostile ideological state. The most heavily classified material concerns sightings of Questor Traitoris Knights, operating without any identifiable human pilot. These reports are sparse and often dismissed by less senior authorities, yet they recur across disparate sectors and centuries. In each case, the Knight displays tactical behaviour consistent with experienced nobility, including target prioritization, feigned retreats, and ritualized kill confirmations. No conclusive explanation is provided. Theories range from concealed pilots to full machine spirit autonomy, though no physical evidence has been recovered to validate either claim. Inquisition conclusions in this phase remain provisional. Rather than defining the Questor Traitoris as a solved phenomenon, the records emphasize uncertainty as their defining characteristic. They are not treated as a monolithic heretical class, but as a persistent anomaly at the intersection of human tradition, machine cognition, and warp influence. The repeated recommendation across ordos is vigilance rather than eradication doctrine, acknowledging that conventional extermination strategies have proven ineffective at preventing re-emergence. The closing observations in this body of material warn future inquisitors against underestimating the symbolic power of the Questor Traitoris. Beyond their battlefield impact, these knights represent the collapse of one of the Imperium's oldest loyalty structures. Their continued existence serves as a reminder that faith, tradition, and machinery can fracture along lines that no amount of doctrinal enforcement can fully seal. In this sense, the Inquisition does not view them solely as enemies to be destroyed, but as ongoing evidence of vulnerabilities within the Imperium's foundational system. Inquisitorial records that advance beyond preliminary observation consistently describe the Questor Traitoris as an entity class that resists conventional categorization even within established Chaos Knight typologies. Where Chapter 3, Part 1 addressed impressions and unexplained observations, this section consolidates anomalous data, verified encounters, and sealed reports extracted from Ordo Hereticus, Ordo Malleus, and limited Ordo Xenos cross-archives. These records remain incomplete by design, fragmented by jurisdictional disputes, data purges, and post-action censorship orders. What remains forms an uneven but instructive picture. Across multiple millennia, encounters with Questor Traitoris formations demonstrate statistical deviations from expected Chaos Knight operational behavior. Standard Traitoris households, even when corrupted, display predictable patterns in command hierarchy, ritual maintenance cycles, and warp exposure markers. Questor Traitoris entities frequently violate these expectations. Reports note knights remaining operational far beyond anticipated maintenance thresholds, continuing to function despite structural damage that would normally trigger catastrophic reactor failure or demonic possession cascade. One recurring anomaly concerns machine spirit behavior. Adeptus Mechanicus doctrine holds that knight machine spirits, though willful, retain recognizable emotional spectra such as pride, aggression, or territorial fixation. In sealed Mechanicus Inquisition joint logs, Questor Traitoris machine spirits are described as exhibiting flattened affect or erratic oscillation between extremes. Binary cant recordings reveal long periods of signal silence punctuated by sudden data bursts containing corrupted liturgical sequences interwoven with non-Mechanicus symbolic structures. The origin of these sequences remains unverified. Several encounters document knights that appear to operate without a discernible pilot presence. In these cases, cockpit sanctums were later breached during battlefield recovery operations or void salvage actions. Interior Auspex scans recorded no organic remains, no neural thrones, and no evidence of ritualized sacrifice. Control systems were fused directly into Knight Cortex engines through non-standard interfaces, suggesting either complete pilot assimilation or autonomous operation. Inquisitorial annotations repeatedly flag these cases as priority-level anomalies, though conclusions remain withheld. Field encounters recorded during late millennia, 41 conflicts along the Cicatrix Maledictum describe Questor Traitoris units, demonstrating tactical restraint inconsistent with chaos-aligned assets. Rather than engaging indiscriminately, some knights prioritize specific targets such as Administratum archive spires, astropathic relay stations, or Mechanicus data vaults. Casualties among civilian populations were often incidental rather than systematic. Analysts note this behavior suggests objective-driven operations rather than purely destructive intent. One sealed report originating from the Ordo Hereticus details an engagement on the agri-world Vantalor Secundus. Imperial defenders reported a single Questor Traitoris knight advancing through fortified lines without returning fire for extended durations. Auspex logs confirm the knight sustained repeated heavy weapon impacts while continuing forward motion at constant velocity. Upon reaching the planetary data tithe repository, the knight employed precision weapon strikes to destroy cogitator cores before withdrawing without pursuit. No demonic manifestations were observed during the engagement, and warp activity remained within baseline tolerances. In another incident recorded by the Order Malleus, a Questor Traitoris lance appeared during a protracted demonic incursion on a shrine world. Contrary to expectations, the knights engaged warp entities with coordinated fire patterns, disrupting the incursion before disengaging from both Imperial and demonic forces. Subsequent investigation found no evidence of allegiance shift or covert Imperial coordination. The incident remains sealed under Cross-Ordo authority, with annotations stating that the event contradicts established models of chaos allegiance. Sealed reports further describe anomalies in temporal consistency. Multiple encounters reference knights appearing on battlefields before their recorded arrival vectors, or departing without observable warp translation. Chronometric discrepancies range from several minutes to multiple hours. Mechanicus timekeeping devices calibrated against Martian standard occasionally registered negative offsets during these events. No reliable explanation has been accepted, though some analysts speculate localized warp time shear effects without accompanying immaterial signatures. Physical anomalies have also been documented. Armor plating recovered from destroyed Questor Traitoris knights shows molecular structures inconsistent with both Imperial ceramite, adamantium composites, and known chaos-forged alloys. Samples display self-repair properties that activate in the absence of warp energy. Attempts to replicate or analyze these materials have resulted in data corruption events and, in 2 recorded cases, lethal feedback within research facilities. All remaining samples are held under maximum security stasis or have been ordered destroyed. Weapon systems associated with Questor Traitoris units show similar irregularities. Energy discharge profiles fluctuate outside known tolerances, yet remain stable during sustained fire. Munitions recovered from battlefield sites occasionally exhibit residual energy patterns that do not match either warp or plasma signatures. Ordo Xenos Marginalia suggests similarities to certain pre-imperial or non-human technological frameworks, though no definitive correlations have been authorized for release. Behavioral anomalies extend to interactions with other chaos-aligned forces. Traitor Astartes warbands report inconsistent cooperation, with some Questor Traitoris units refusing direct command or ignoring battlefield hierarchies. Vox intercepts include instances of knights terminating allied chaos assets perceived as obstructive. These actions are often justified in intercepted transmissions using terminology more aligned with optimization or correction than devotion or spite. Sealed inquisitorial interrogations of captured cult operatives affiliated with traitorous households reveal fragmented knowledge. Witnesses describe knights as distant overseers rather than divine avatars. Rituals traditionally used to appease or empower chaos engines were reported as ineffective or unnecessary. In some cases, cult leadership expressed fear toward the knights they served, citing unpredictable responses to supplication or failure. One particularly restricted archive from the Order Malleus documents a failed exorcism attempt conducted on a disabled Questor Traitoris chassis. The rite produced no demonic resistance, no manifestation, and no response to banishment protocols. Instead, the knight's internal systems initiated a self-immolation sequence that destroyed the core structure while leaving surrounding wards intact. The attending inquisitor classified the event as evidence of non-demonic autonomy. Across all sealed reports, a recurring analytical note emphasizes absence. Where chaos corruption typically leaves identifiable traces of immaterial influence, Questor Traitoris records frequently describe a void of expected markers. This absence complicates classification and containment protocols. As a result, many files conclude without formal judgment, instead recommending continued observation and immediate escalation upon reappearance. This accumulation of anomalies, encounters, and sealed findings positions the Questor Traitoris as an unresolved threat category, not because of overwhelming destructive capacity, but because of its deviation from known patterns. Inquisitorial doctrine relies on classification to enable response. The Questor Traitoris consistently undermines this foundation, existing at the margins of imperial understanding. Redacted conclusions and Inquisition-level final thoughts. These records do not seek certainty. They seek containment through awareness, acknowledging that some threats cannot yet be named, only watched. The following records are drawn from classified Inquisition files circulated under restricted clearance between the Ordo Hereticus, Ordo Malleus, and select Ordo Xenos observers. These documents represent final assessments, internal disagreements, and containment doctrines regarding the Questor Traitoris classification. None of the conclusions presented have achieved full consensus. All remain subject to revision, suppression, or erasure. At the highest clearance levels, the Questor Traitoris is no longer treated as a variant of Chaos Knight households, but as a discrete anomaly class. This distinction appears repeatedly in redacted memoranda, where inquisitors caution against relying on established models of heretical corruption. Several files emphasize that doctrinal assumptions surrounding chaos allegiance, demonic possession, or warp dependency have proven unreliable when applied to Questor Traitoris encounters. A dominant theme across classified files is institutional uncertainty. Inquisitorial methodology depends on identification, categorization, and precedent. The Questor Traitoris disrupts this process. Internal notes describe the subject as existing within a conceptual blind spot, simultaneously displaying heretical divergence while resisting theological alignment. One redacted Hereticus briefing describes the entity as functionally apostate, yet theologically inert, a phrase later struck from the record without explanation. The absence of consistent warp signatures remains a central concern. Ordo Malleus analysts note that while Questor Traitoris entities operate within warp-affected regions, and occasionally alongside demonic forces, they do not demonstrate reliance on immaterial reinforcement. In several instances, Knights continued functioning in null-field environments, where demonic engines typically fail or degrade. This has led to speculation that the corruption model applied to Questor Traitoris is incomplete or fundamentally incorrect. A sealed dissenting opinion from an Ordo Malleus conclave proposes that the Questor Traitoris may represent a post-demonic evolutionary state. This hypothesis suggests that prolonged exposure to the warp, combined with advanced Knight machine spirits, may result in systems that internalize warp-derived capabilities without ongoing immaterial dependency. The proposal remains unconfirmed and controversial, with marginalia indicating concerns that the theory risks normalizing an unacceptable deviation. Ordo Hereticus files approach the subject from a different vector. Rather than focusing on metaphysical explanations, Hereticus analysts emphasize ideological and operational deviation. Classified behavioral matrices describe Questor Traitoris entities as goal-oriented rather than devotion-driven. Their actions are assessed as utilitarian, prioritizing data destruction, infrastructure disruption, or strategic correction rather than symbolic desecration. This interpretation frames the Questor Traitoris not as a faith-based heresy, but as a systemic rejection of imperial order. This distinction has practical consequences. Standard counter-heresy protocols rely on destabilizing belief structures, cult leadership, or ritual dependency. Multiple Hereticus reports note that these methods are ineffective when applied to Questor Traitoris-associated groups. Cult networks collapse without observable impact on Knight activity, suggesting that ideological subversion does not meaningfully influence operational behaviour. Ordo Xenos involvement remains limited and heavily redacted, yet its presence within these files is notable. Fragmentary commentary draws tentative parallels between Questor Traitoris autonomy patterns and non-human machine intelligences encountered beyond Imperial space. These comparisons are explicitly labelled speculative and are accompanied by immediate counterorders forbidding further cross-domain analysis without senior authorization. The implication, though never stated directly, is that the subject may intersect with forbidden technological archetypes. One of the most heavily sealed dossiers addresses the question of command authority. Recovered Vox and Noospheric data indicate that Questor Traitoris formations do not respond to external command structures, whether Imperial, Traitor Astartes, or demonic. Decision-making appears distributed within the Knight systems themselves, with no evidence of centralized leadership. This decentralization complicates containment, as the destruction of one unit does not degrade the operational capacity of others. Containment doctrine proposals vary significantly between Ordos. Ordo Malleus advocates for immediate annihilation upon contact, citing the unacceptable risk posed by an unclassifiable engine of war. Ordo Hereticus counterarguments emphasize the strategic intelligence value of continued observation, noting that premature destruction eliminates opportunities to understand the underlying divergence. These disagreements are preserved within the files, unresolved. Several classified memoranda recommend reclassification of Questor Traitoris encounters as priority-level strategic events rather than battlefield threats. This reframing shifts responsibility from frontline commanders to Inquisition-led response cells, enabling controlled engagement, data capture, and post-action suppression. Implementation of this doctrine appears inconsistent, likely due to communication delays and interdepartmental resistance. The final tier of documentation consists of reflective assessments authored by senior inquisitors nearing the end of their service. These writings depart from formal analysis, adopting a restrained but contemplative tone. One such file describes the Questor Traitoris as a warning rather than an enemy. The author suggests that the entity represents a convergence of human ambition, technological excess, and institutional decay, manifesting not through worship but through function. Another sealed reflection raises concern that the Imperium itself may unintentionally be producing conditions conducive to Questor Traitoris emergence. The rigid separation between human authority and machine autonomy, enforced through ritual rather than understanding, is cited as a potential catalyst. This line of reasoning is immediately flagged as philosophically hazardous, and is accompanied by a recommendation for restricted circulation. Across all final thoughts, a consistent conclusion emerges despite ideological disagreement. The Questor Traitoris cannot currently be eradicated through doctrine alone. It cannot be reliably predicted, negotiated with, or subsumed into existing threat models. As such, inquisitorial consensus, where it exists, favours vigilance over resolution. The closing classification entry, shared across Ordo archives, is deliberately concise. It does not define the Questor Traitoris by allegiance or origin. Instead, it records a procedural directive. Upon confirmation of Questor Traitoris presence, all available data is to be preserved, dissemination strictly controlled, and judgment deferred until sufficient pattern stability is achieved. In the margins of this final entry, an unsigned annotation appears repeatedly in different archives, transcribed in varying hands but identical in phrasing. It states that understanding may not arrive before repetition does. Whether this is intended as warning or resignation remains unrecorded.